Welcome, Anja. Thank you so much for joining us today and for traveling so far to be here. I wanted to ask you, first of all, you've enjoyed a successful international career of over 20 years in library management and library automation. So could you tell us a bit about that? And then also, what do you consider to be some highlights of your career?
Oh, wow. It's difficult to think of highlights even. Every job I've had, and there were 7 in over 25 years, so that's, for a librarian, that's a lot. Yes. But I've enjoyed every one of them. Mostly, many of them were too short. One of the highlights, maybe even, of what I did was in 2001. I had a sabbatical leave of 3 months, and what I did was I prepared that for 6 months, and I traveled throughout the U.S. for 2 months and 1 month in the UK. And I visited, I think, over 30 libraries, library organizations, and I went to Ann Arbor to go to JSTOR, for example. And I think I learned so much from that. That's where my international activities really started, because I also built the network. That's also how I got a job 3 years later in the US.
Great.
So that's one of the highlights, definitely. And of course, the 3 years in the US were a highlight too. We have such a global profession. We have a global network. We recognize each other's work all over the globe, and so that was why I really wanted the international experience. I thought that would help the institutions that I would work for. So that was something, and there is absolutely a line, a red thread throughout everything that I did, and I'm so thankful and that I could do all that and use my experience now in several ways.
Well, terrific. We're so glad that you're here and sharing your experiences with us now. I really enjoyed your session this morning, your plenary presentation.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
All right, I will now ask a question about a provocative paper that you delivered at the Fiesole retreat in 2015 in Berlin.
Yes.
And as a collection development librarian, I have to be somewhat alarmed.
Ooh.
That you were thinking the unthinkable, the library without a collection.
Yeah.
What do you mean by this?
Well, if you start thinking about open science, and it all started with the thought about open publications, and if that comes to life, and you think of the scenario where everything that is published, let's define it, let's limit it to publications at this point. Everything's published open access. Let me ask you the question, how do you then build a collection, and why? Because your researchers will be able to access all the knowledge that is published.
Yeah.
So,
well, as an intermediary, without an intermediary role, the collection now is defined by what we're paying for.
yes.
So what you're talking about then is...
Everything's free.
Yes.
So what would then be the reason to make any kind of selection? Because that's what we do as libraries. We select, and the border of that, the limitation is the budget that we have, and of course, and then we try to serve our users best within the budget. That's usually in practice how it goes. So if everything's out open, why would you then make a selection? Maybe we will. But I wanted to point out that it's not a given that we will always do that. And maybe this scenario will not come to life, I don't know. But if we have to question how much we invest in making a selection for our users, if they can do it better themselves on the internet and tools that they can just use, we have to focus on something else, or we should acknowledge that that is not where our added value is anymore. And that was really the message that I wanted to send.
And I think at some level then, the question becomes less of selection and more of discovery.
It could be.
For the user.
Yeah.
So for the user, the question of discovery; for the library, then Are you providing discovery opportunities, or does somebody else?
Exactly, and what we're seeing, our first idea was thinking the unthinkable, a library without a catalog. Why limit your users to your own collection in their initial search?
Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense anymore. And then the next thing is maybe not a collection either. So I'm not saying that we cannot play a role in helping our users in discovery, but we will have to redefine it at least.
What would be the direction you would go in? I know it's unthinkable at this point, but
well, on a very practical level, my library still has its old-fashioned catalog, and we will turn it off next year or in 2018, and we will not buy a discovery system. So that is how we put this in practice. We direct people to the internet, the different tools, the electronic bibliographies, and it's also because of the fact that bibliographies now have links to content, and you can link out, that is something that makes the catalog sort of obsolete. So we will point them to all these other other systems and possibilities, and just have no catalog anymore. Yeah, for internal purposes, but not for our users, not for discovery.
So you don't select any longer, but you point people to content.
Well, we do have.
As
we still
librarians.
have a collection, of course, because
course.
But as librarians, we have more the consulting role,
Yeah.
and of course we help students, to find information and so on. But it's more of a consultant's role. It's not the gateway.
Yes.
It's not like go here and you will find everything you need.
Mm-hmm.
We will say to them, what are you looking for? Well, we will point you in a direction and we'll help you in using the tools that are appropriate for you.
So are local libraries in the future a more relevant resource than an entity that might be more like a consortium, or one entity that would be to serve many?
In terms of collection, it can only go global,
Yeah.
is what I'm thinking. Consortia, that's already there.
Yeah. Or
In regions, there's already a group catalog
Yes.
and sharing and
Yes.
so forth. So we're going to the next level. That's what I'm thinking. Interestingly enough, some things become more local, because if you think about the consultant role of librarians, you have to be close to your users. So in some ways, a consortia won't really help you. That's something that you do by yourself.
Yeah.
So in some ways, you become more local, and you want to be closer to your community. It's interesting. In the 80s, we closed many branch libraries because we thought, they're not using the physical collection anymore, so we closed them. Now, today, I would not close them anymore. I would keep them open, but have a different function as a study space or whatever.
yeah.
So it's, in some ways, it's also going sort of back.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So this idea of the collection is so. This is a really impactful discussion right now, I think, and really timely. For one thing, I think what libraries traditionally measured our value in the sense that we had a handle on what is our collection,
Yeah.
that we could conceive of it in numbers, we could conceive of it in volumes,
Yeah.
in how many journals we subscribe to. Right, it was a collection that we could really get our arms around in a way.
Yeah.
And so I think what's so difficult for people in our profession to allow is that maybe in the future that's not how this is going to look, and that the clout and renown of a library is not going to be tied to how many books you have, how many journal packages you subscribe to, and how many things you have. So that's hard to let go of. It feels like we're taking a huge risk, and it feels like we are sort of letting go of our children in a way. They're leaving the nest, and we don't have control over them anymore. So I think these are really timely. This is the time to be talking about this, because what can we then focus on? What can we refocus on? And then how do we refocus our users and how they see our value? So your discussion of libraries and our added value, it really hit home this morning in the session. And so that was going to be one of my questions, was what are these value-added services that we can now start to use in a way to rebrand ourselves, or almost sell ourselves to a user community who's already seen us as a trusted partner in a certain role. And those of us in collection development in particular, I think, are really having to rethink our value. And you started talking a bit about getting rid of discovery at the library level, which we know that our students are not going to our library catalog. I do a lot of instruction in my role at my college, and when I ask students, where do you go to start your research, they unabashedly tell me that they go to Google or Google Scholar, and I use Google every single day in my personal life as well, in my research life. Yeah, or Wikipedia. I use these things, right? So I wonder what you think about the added value now in our service of maybe helping students to navigate this world in which they aren't just looking at a collection that we have gathered from outside sources and we're telling them, so you can trust this because it's in the library. Instead, they're seeking information in this global environment, and they no longer feel like they can trust everything. So how do you feel about our role in that piece of things? Yeah,
well, there we are, the teacher. First of all, I'd like to say that I totally agree with you on what the trend that you describe, and also how hard it is for us as professionals, but also, of course, for users. It's got two sides. The users still see us as a collection of books too. So there's a lot to work on. Because even if we sort of find a way and see what we want to do, we have to make sure that our users know and understand our added value in new areas. So there's so much to work on. Yes. And my library now is working on a project with a high school on information literacy.
Oh, terrific.
Because, of course, when students come to our college or university, they have already experience with searching for information and making for doing presentations in school. So we try to try and see what is it that they learn in high school, and how can we follow up so that it's a continuum, so that when they get to university, they are ready to learn the next level of how do you assess information that you find on the internet. I think, you grow up, your parents have a role, your school have, etc. So that is important, and I really think that information literacy becomes more important. It's almost like information literacy was a little bit like, we'll show you how the catalog works. Let's inform you on Boolean search. So that is gone. Or Boolean search when it's appropriate in other systems. You can teach them. And I used to think that information literacy teaching was not so important, but I think it's much more important in this global situation, in this digital environment. So we need very good teachers for the students, and we need to be consultants for the researchers. That is the big shift. We're not a gateway anymore. We are consultants and teachers. And we will have to prove our added value just by doing it.
Right.
And we don't know all the new areas. I think research data, we talked a little bit about that in the Q&A. Well, that is an area where, IT might think that that's our business because this is about storage. But it's also about a culture shift. It is about metadata. It's about how do I share data. So we have a role there, and we can just start doing it and finding out what the role exactly is. And so the new roles are not clear yet. Some of them, information literacy is maybe the easiest. We've already been doing that, and I think it will become more intense and more important.
You know, I sometimes find when I talk to researchers that they are searching for information in ways that the librarians are not teaching them.
Exactly.
And the librarians are often teaching people to do searches in ways that the users don't do.
Exactly.
So
And
I'm wondering to what you have to say to that.
yes, well, we see that too. You know, we assess our services. We do a survey, and that's what you know, we think we help people, and they say, really? To a certain extent. So absolutely. So what we need to do is have this close connection and to understand the workflows of the researchers, and that's also why we have to be very close to our users. We have to understand them. So disciplinary backgrounds of the librarians who speak the language, etc. It becomes more and more important, because if we don't do that, we will not play a role. And that is an area where we can help people. Until you know it's clear, it's proven that we don't play a role. I do believe we have. We absolutely
have. It is
have.
an interesting question. If the librarians are meant to teach the users to search, and the users, the researchers, have their own methods, to what extent is the librarian the authority about searching at that?
Oh yeah, I don't think we ever had an authority. Maybe back in the card catalog days, but we're certainly not the authority. But we can help categorize, and it's still the case that there's bibliographies and there's systems that people use, and our core competencies lie around information. The researcher's expertise is another expertise. So I'm sure there are things about information, knowledge, publications, data, whatever, that the researcher either, you know, it's not his core competency, and it might also be things that, you know, don't want to be bothered with. So I'm not sure if we will act as people who save the other person time and or add expertise. I think both, to be honest. But it will be different for each discipline, and it will also evolve with the with the way that research is done and the way that information is provided.
So you think, in a lot of ways, it's the infrastructure, metadata, stuff like that, that is more the contribution that we would make.
Yes, and we will not create metadata anymore. I mean, that used to be our core thing, and that's different.
What would we do?
We are the consultants.
In what sense?
We help, well, for example, we will help researchers to manage their data, their research data. I absolutely believe that. To help them think about how will you store it so that you can share it. How do you order things? We are all about ordering things, to have a systematic, because it's so interesting, because in the rise of the internet you see a renewed wish for categories and for labeling things. Oh yeah, we know about labeling things, and that's what I'm thinking of if I'm thinking of maybe the near future. Yeah. I'm not yet there where I say, well, you know, we don't have to do all that.
So maybe we do. I see it as we have a role in the research process. We really do.
Yeah.
But we have to be a bit more painfully aware, in some sense, that what we think our users need often does not align with what they want. and what they're asking us for.
Oh.
And so there's always that breakdown, and there's sort of that this tension or competing interests at heart. And so it would serve us well maybe to rethink our role in the research life cycle, and that it's maybe not our best use of resources and energy and time and money to help them search necessarily, but maybe helping. I don't know if you get questions from researchers at your institutions about making connections, this sort of scholarly communication landscape, and we get questions even at my very small college about I'd love to know who else is working on something that intersects with my research interests. I'd love for there to be a service when I'm searching for articles or when I'm searching for data. I would love for there to be something that's sort of pushing a connection to me where I could maybe make help develop my network in this area that I'm interested in that's maybe very specialized or very niche, right? So I wonder too what you think about librarians as having an increased role now as almost being advocates or emissaries in a way to our content providers, to people who are building the systems where researchers are going to collect this data or they're going to do their data management. Do we have an increased role now to be a voice for them when we meet with vendors, when we meet with publishers, when we meet with systems developers? Should we be asking for more, and how do we do that?
In the landscape where we deal with sort of the traditional partners, let's say publishers, mm-hmm. I think we have the intermediate role. We do. Because there's still this question of providing access and how does it happen and what are the conditions. Mm-hmm. So I think we do have that role. What I'm thinking of when you were talking is, let's say there's a researcher, and I've had this case that says, well, for my research, I need data from Facebook. How do I connect with the people from Facebook to get data that I want to use in my social sciences research? And I'm not sure if you were thinking about an example like that.
The sort of non-traditional content provider, right?
Yeah, exactly. So of course, we didn't have the immediate answer to that, but we could help with thinking about what to ask from Facebook, and what to talk about or what to think about in terms of, okay, when you get the data, then what you do, mm-hmm. or what format, mm-hmm. or how will you be able to get it so that you can use it? What are the license conditions that you want to, the reuse conditions that you are looking for? Are you aware of what you can then do with that data in terms of publishing them yourselves? Are you aware of the Creative Commons licenses? So there is an area where we can help make the connections. Maybe less of an intermediary role. That could well be. Can I come back to the collection for a minute? Of course. Because there's another thing that's happening. And we've seen that also, but in those libraries where you have historic collections, where you have special collections, older materials, I'm not sure what your experiences are, but it seems like those become more of the symbol of the collection.
Yes.
We have a very strong symbolic value, if you will. Everybody loves libraries, right? I always think that never change the name. And it is something, and you can say, well, it's symbolic and it's not private, but it's also something that people can and want to connect with. It is really meaningful. Yeah. So in terms of collections, what I'm seeing is that in many libraries, what is happening and being invested in special collections grows. And maybe it's to replace a little bit, like we used to have this collection and you can count the books. Mm-hmm. Much of that we're saying, it's maybe not so important anymore to have that, or we can just share that. But this bit that is maybe special to a group of people because they can relate to the content or to the historic value or the place of origin or whatever. But that sort of replaces it maybe, and also is a continuation of the feel that people have for libraries and the connection that they want to make.
Interesting. Well, maybe we'll get back to, we can always come back, but we're going to get back to some of these questions that we had. So one of your interests, of course, that came out in the plenary presentation was preservation and perpetual access. So you express concern, actually, that the open access is a business model, maybe not so much as a movement, but as a business model, introduces new problems for this role in providing perpetual access and in preservation. Could you expand on that?
Well, maybe it's because I sort of didn't expect that. You know, you're moving to an open world, and that's completely aligned with our core mission, of course. And then at some point, it seems like on the one hand is open also closes another door. It opens a door and it closes a door on the back files. I'm not sure why. It's also because of business models. So then, what is more important? Almost like Anne said, and that's a horrible question. But I also remember that I was in negotiations a couple of years ago with a very large publisher, the larger publisher in the world. And we had a researcher at the table because we thought it would be useful to have a prominent researcher. And he said, "Oh, don't bother about, everything that's new we share among each other. What's really important is the archives." Of course, this was physics.
Yeah.
So, it's a discipline, and they have already among themselves a very active network of sharing. So he says, "Oh, why do we need a license anyway? No, I'm only interested in the archives. I want to be able to go back."
Yeah.
And so that is also what I remember, what startled me. I was like, oh, the rest you can do yourself. And now I'm thinking, oh, if open access to publication is on the agenda of people who do not have a long-term view, politicians, administrators maybe, then it should be our agenda to try and think, okay, what are we going to do? Because that is something that I'm not convinced that other parties will find as important as we think it's important. And I do expect from libraries, like Anne said, that this is a concern and we somehow need to address it. And as I said, we've been doing lots of things, and then when you really want to cancel a contract and you try to understand how can I offer my archives to my users, and you do the investigation and it turns out it's impossible, you really have a problem. And my feeling is that we've been, like I said, we've been ignoring it a little bit. Oh well, we'll probably always have a contract. Oh well. But it's so difficult.
I think it is an interesting question for a profession that has in the past always been, the status has been as intermediary between information producers, publishers and whatnot, and users, but it's also been one of preservation because it's the print things. But in a changed open environment, the question whether we have any particular reason to be involved in the preservation of those materials, well, we don't buy them and we don't house them. It's true also of the question of, like with APCs, people often say, well, the library has all the money for subscriptions, maybe we should also pay the APCs, but it doesn't make that much sense.
No, it doesn't.
So if the library is no longer preserving collections, nor is it an intermediary in an open environment, the question also with data, are we the best people to preserve data? Just because we preserved collections in the past? Do we have the technical skills? Do we have the know-how? So in my mind, one of the questions that comes, you got to really rethink pretty hard what your purpose is. And that's the question I would have for you at that level. Okay, you're going to be consultants. To what?
It has, if we have any added value in this new environment where we do not have the IT skills that IT people have to store, for example, big data and so on, we don't. We don't have that tradition. If we have any added value, it has to be around our core competencies that have been around for thousands of years. It has to come from our profession. And again, that is, it has to be tied to the metadata thing. We have the competency to look at how do you describe different versions of stuff, the whole methodology of thinking about that. That is where what we can use in a new environment, in a new way. It has a different, it will be a different service. It will look like something different. But it has to derive from that, from our core core competencies. I couldn't say it any differently.
So if we had these core competencies, are they the core competences we have now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so that is why many libraries say in research data management, we play a role. And you cannot leave it to IT, which only looks at, it's IT, it's storage, and it's metadata a little bit, and it's a little bit culture shift, and it's a little bit management, and it's a little bit, it's all of those things, and it's a little bit IT. And also, I'm sure that in many universities, it's true that the librarians have all the context. They're much closer to the researchers and to the community than other services in universities. So we also have the experience to work with researchers closely. Mm-hmm. And that is a competency that you want to use, next to what the IT does. But it's a mix. It's the people from the legal office. It's the people from IT. It's the people who develop the policy for education and research on an institutional level. And it's us. It's departments who look at how do researchers get funding. Because the funders now, of course, have requirements for et cetera, et cetera. So it has to be a collaborative. It's like Jim Neal said so appropriately, you're sharing your limbs.
Oh, right.
With some of it is coming from another. Yeah, so it may be that as a library, we become much more invisible.
Yeah.
We used to be in a specific corner. Oh, they're doing their own thing. If we keep on being, organizations in a corner somewhere, will vanish. Nobody wants to invest that in the long term. So we need to blend in. And at the same time, I think if you look at an issue like preservation, we have to collaborate on a national, international scale among the professionals and say, we're not going to bother with long-term preservation other than we point to a party who's going to do it. That's also always very difficult, but try to sort of get resources together to work on that issue. In smaller countries like my country, we can point to a national library and say that is the core business of a national library, and we're going to look to that library for preservation and access. So stop thinking, I want to provide access as a single library, but really collaborate. So some things you want to do within the profession, and long-term preservation seems to me a topic that could be further developed there. And then the other part will just blend in and will be just one of the parties. I'm not sure whether we will survive as a separate institution. It may be, but it may not be. And that's, of course, I think that's not our main goal. Right? Our main goal is make sure that what society needs or our users need is provided. And if we can add value, wonderful. If not,
So maybe I'll bring it back to then. It sounds like we know how to save the world, right? Like we know how to we know how to save the world. We know how to save libraries now. We know we know the possibilities. We have some ideas for our emerging roles in this 21st century world of information seeking and research. So then how do we as professionals who go through a certain step-by-step process of getting our degree, going to library school, getting maybe an internship or an assistantship somewhere, getting our first professional role, and then of course, hopefully succeeding up to the stars, right? Where along those lines, how are we going to learn how to do these new things? How are we going to learn how to be these new, valuable presences on our campuses and in our libraries? And this is maybe it's a bit of a theoretical question too, because it requires a shift in mindset, and it requires that our educational system really rethink. So I went to library school not that long ago. It's been within the last decade that I've graduated from library school, and I will admit that I learned almost nothing that applies to what my future trajectory in this profession now looks like. So
wow.
What do you think are the ways that we're going to learn how to be in this new role or in this new shifting landscape?
Wow, that's so interesting. With this respect, we really come from a different world. In my country, we do not have library schools anymore.
No.
Really?
For precisely this reason.
Wow.
And they went away because, and this is my third library that I'm a director of, I have never hired people from library school. It's very different in Europe from the situation in the US. In that, and let me talk about my own country, I know
Sure.
best of that situation, but since the digital era, I think we have been trying to hire people, recruit people who have new skills. Because if you don't have the new skills in-house, you cannot change. And the moment you see you want to change. And of course, we had enough of the competencies, the more classical competencies, we needed new ones. And we still do. We hire people who have been trained as a professional teacher to teach information literacy. We recruit people who have just had their PhDs in any discipline, so that they are the consultants for the researchers in that discipline. These people have now no experience in libraries. They have no library school background. So they work very differently. What I see now, I must confess, that the core values that you learn in library school, they do matter. So now we're looking at how do we train a person that comes in to the library about the core values, core issues, the history of the library. What is a research library compared to a library that is maybe more like a college library and more focused on education? What's the difference? What's the difference in collection building? And all of that, it matters. So now we're trying to see another gap, because we got more and more new people in who have wonderful new competencies that we need. So, but then there's this other gap. But it seems to us that is doable to sort of solve that problem. But at least we have new competencies. We have people who have experience in research, in managing research data, or analytics. Well, all of those things. So we hire people to do that. And then again, it's also true, what we talked about earlier, is that what is a library? What is the concept of the library? And before you know it, the new people also think, oh, it's books. So what you have to do is in-house talk about this and talk about the concept. What are we about? How are we different from an IT department in the university? And that has to do with our history and our profession. And you have to talk about it. We now are thinking of making an introductory program for every new staff member to talk about these things. But we shouldn't do that as a library by ourselves, of course. It should be, maybe that's the new education. Education is difficult, and I think there's more disciplines nowadays where people think, well, these people come fresh from school and their knowledge is already outdated. So maybe it should be professional education. You come into a profession and then you learn along the way, and we have to have maybe library schools that do just that.
That seems to be what happens organically a lot of the times anyway. You know?
Yeah.
The conferences and so on.
Yep.
Yeah, that's partly how we do it. We travel a lot.
Yeah.
And I always encourage people to do that, and we luckily have the budget to do that, because that's the way we learn. And it's still important, but it cannot be the only way.
Well, you know, the one, when we've been talking about an open environment, and I'm thinking when you're just talking about the difference between Europe and the US about this, about teacher education and so on, what is the difference you see now and in the near future between how open environments exist in the United States, open publication obviously, and open publication exists in Europe?
Well, there shouldn't be a difference. Our researchers and our students also, I think, increasingly work in international networks. So open is global. If it's not global, it's not open. So it should be this global knowledge environment. And the trends are that in all among us, I think, there's global players for so many things, even for local services like Uber and Airbnb and all of that. So that is the direction. Of course,
the EU has a different function in driving open access, or the British government, than does the United States government. Wouldn't you think that?
well, I'm not sure.
No.
The EU says we want open science.
Mm-hmm.
Open science is crucial to stay a competitive region in the world. Well, that's what every region wants, right? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. There might be differences, and there's difference in time, and difference in players, and etc. But if this is true, if open science is crucial to be competitive in the world, well, then it should be possible to make a connection, at least, in the way we do that. And this is maybe also where libraries are wonderful advocates, because we are so used to standards. Standardizing is our thing.
Oh, yes.
Well, standardizing in making an open world of information is crucial. So again, a core competency that we used to use for the carrot catalog, we can now use for other services and we're not the only ones who believe that, but it's important. So, and I'm not sure exactly how fast things go. I know that, of course, on a federal level in the US, there's also a drive for open. And open data also, but I'm not sure exactly how that works in terms of influence on what really happens. So I don't know the landscape well enough to understand the biggest research funders. Maybe what is crucial that we do is look at the network of research funders in the world. Which ones are local, which ones are global, and if they align their policies, and they've already started to do that also, that is an important basis, or maybe a group to work with. As libraries, I think we should stress the global collaboration.
Well, at some level, what's interesting is when resources are increasingly available free to the user, the question of discovery for that user is not local any longer. So, as you've said, you don't need really to provide a discovery tool on a local collection any longer. But I guess one of the questions I have is, how can discovery become more global, as in it's free, everything's free to the user? How can that user have a discovery tool that is more global and less more Google-like in that sense, but not just for not also for vacation sites and so on? How can discovery catch up with the openness and availability of information?
Well, that's interesting, because there's an assumption under your question, and that is that there should be discovery for scholarly information.
Yeah.
Well, there's Google Scholar, and there will be others. We don't have to do that. The market will do that.
Right. So if it has nothing to do with libraries,
No.
where's it going to come from? Where is global discovery going to come from?
Well, it comes from private companies right now.
Yeah.
So as long as there's parties who have an interest in some way, they will do it. And I'm also convinced that you have to do in the public domain what cannot be done successfully in the market. But if something is of interest, the market can do it better. We could never have developed a Google or Google Scholar. And we were the ones, libraries, who said, we know about retrieval. That is our expertise.
Yeah.
I'd like to wrap us up on a fun question. So, Anja, I'm sure that you, as we all do a ton of reading of professional literature, articles, papers, white papers, everything under the sun that has to do with librarianship and data and preservation, etc. What's the last thing you read for fun?
For fun and not professionally.
No, just something for fun that you enjoyed, maybe a novel or,
Oh. Let me think. I'm reading a novel right now, which is very interesting, but may not sound as fun so much. It's called Stasiland, and it's of a German author who writes about how the Stasi worked in the German Democratic Republic, but it's written so well that it's almost funny.
Okay.
There's so much humor in it.
Little Stasi humor.
Yeah.
That I learned something, but it's also funny. It's because of the skills of the writer, and she's got so much humor that I'm enjoying this tremendously. And of course, I brought it on my e-reader.
Oh, good for you. Okay.
Because if you travel a lot, an e-reader is just wonderful. It's just that you don't know exactly how to hold it.
And you can't smell it. That's my problem. I want to smell that
really?
book. Yeah, I like book smell.
Really?
Yeah.
Old smelly
I love
book?
old smelly books.
Okay. You are a real librarian.
Well, on that, thank you so much, Anja. Thank you for joining us and for all of your insight and expertise. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting discussion.